Hello and welcome to Amazing Stories from the Hood. I'm your host Bryan, and this is episode 5 entitled, Do You Believe in Destiny? Part 1. Our story opens up with Gary, who at 12 years old has just made a big decision in his life. But first, a little background. Gary grew up in the inner city. Gary's mother became pregnant at 15 years old with Gary. Gary was considered an illegitimate child as his father was already married to someone else and significantly older than Gary's mother. The prospect of calling Gary illegitimate prompted his mother to always be upfront with Gary and explain everything. She always emphasized to Gary that he was her miracle child and the chief reason why she changed her life. 3 years after Gary was born, his mother started working for the post office. After a few months working at the post office, Gary's mother became romantically involved with her supervisor. After a 2-year relationship, Gary's mother and her supervisor were married. Gary's biological father had always maintained an amicable relationship with his mother and also developed an amicable relationship with Gary's stepfather. All of these factors contributed to Gary being a well-adjusted child. At 8 years old and in the 3rd grade, Gary was encouraged by his teachers to enter into a spelling bee. He was a little reluctant, but he did it and then he won. Winning the spelling bee seemed to cause a shift in the behavior of all the people in Gary's life. Gary saw himself as just a regular kid who enjoyed going outside to play and watching cartoons on Saturday morning. But after winning the spelling bee, Gary's biological father made arrangements with Gary's mother to start spending more time with Gary. So on Saturdays, Gary's father began taking him out to parks and museums, and even went to the opera. And Gary, who had gone to church every Sunday with his family, was now being introduced to members of the congregation that he had previously never known. And they all seemed to have the same interest in Gary being a part of their youth groups. Even the attitudes of Gary's friends, whom he had grown up with and been playing with all his life, seemed to change. They began seeking his advice instead of just seeking his company. Soon, Gary's friends began introducing him to their other friends. They would invite him to their birthday parties and want them to come play with him. At school, the teachers and faculty began showing Gary so much more attention and making suggestions about curriculum that previously hadn't been mentioned. At 8 years old, Gary was reluctant to go against these changes, and for the next 4 years he played along. And that brings us to Gary at 12 years old in the 7th grade, where the story begins. Gary had received an invitation and attended a birthday party for one of his friends, where he was introduced to a girl named Denise. Gary had an instant liking for Denise, and she seemed to feel the same way about Gary. Gary and Denise enjoyed each other's company throughout the entire party, and when it was time to go, they exchanged phone numbers. This was the first time Gary had developed a liking for a girl that was more than just friends. Gary's parents came to pick him up after the party, and on the way home, Gary began to wonder if his reputation for popularity had caused Denise to like him, or if she liked him just for him. Because Gary knew he had been going along with the popularity that he achieved from the spelling bee, it was more important now for him to know whether Denise liked him because he was popular, or if she liked him because of who he was. So Gary made up his mind to stop playing along. When Gary's friends nominated him at school for class president, he declined. And when his teachers at school volunteered him for advanced placement classes, Gary declined. And Gary stopped attending the youth groups at church. Gary's change in behavior caused his parents to wonder if he was okay and what was going on with him, and Gary just rebelled against their care and concern. Gary also refused to go with his biological father on Saturdays anymore. All while this was happening, Gary and Denise's relationship was growing. They would talk on the phone for hours, and during one conversation, Denise asked Gary what was going on with him and why he refused the nomination for class president. It was this question that triggered Gary's suspicions again, and he was confirmed that Denise only wanted to be with him because he was popular. Gary immediately cut it off with Denise. The effect that it had on Gary was tremendous, and Gary began a downward spiral that affected all areas of his life. In a short amount of time, Gary had become sullen and withdrawn and a very moody teenager. His parents were at a loss to understand what was happening and asked Gary's friends if they knew what was going on, but Gary had cut them off as well, and they could not provide an answer for his parents. Gary's biological father began to blame Gary's mother and stepfather for the change in Gary's behavior, and their relationship deteriorated as well. The stress of Gary's behavior caused Gary's mother and stepfather to have problems in their relationship, and within 2 years they were divorced. After the divorce, Gary, who now at 15 years old and heading to the 10th grade, decided to drop out of school. Gary's mother, unwilling to accept his decision, put her foot down, and Gary ran away from home. After learning that Gary had run away from home, Gary's mother immediately alerted the authorities, gave a description of her son in the hopes that they would bring him back. Gary, who had no experience being on his own, was found by the authorities a couple of days later, but he escaped. Fearing that he was a fugitive now and would be going to jail if they found him, Gary made his way to the piers and stowed away on a ship. When Gary felt the ship start moving, he realized he had no idea what the destination was. But Gary's imagination had gotten the better of him, and he imagined himself on a wanted poster, and he figured, wherever I'm going, it's better than here, and that all he could do was wait for the ship to stop. After a few days, the ship pulled in, and Gary got off. He was happy to learn that he was at least still in the United States. Gary wandered the streets in this new town, and after a few days, his hunger got the better of him, and he was caught shoplifting food from the grocery store. The owners of the grocery store took pity on him, and after hearing his story, gave him a job bagging groceries. The version of Gary's story involved him being an orphan and having to endure abuse at the hands of the faculty at the orphanage where he escaped from. So the owners of the grocery store didn't even know about Gary's parents. The owners also guided Gary to the shelter where he was able to live as long as he maintained a job bagging groceries. Over the next few months, Gary and friends he made at the shelter saved their money and moved into an apartment. When the owners of the grocery store, who were impressed with Gary's work, tried to promote him, they found out that he had dropped out of school and was not able to be promoted to stock clerk until he at least had a GED. Gary, however, was uninterested and perfectly fine being a bag boy. He explained to the owners that if he could stay being a bag boy, that was perfectly fine with him. The owners, however, saw things differently. They recognized the value in a good worker, and they recognized the value in Gary. They emphasized to Gary that if he wished to keep working there, he was going to have to get a GED, and they would pay for it. Given that ultimatum, Gary reluctantly agreed. One of Gary's roommates from the shelter had lost his job and was unable to come up with his share of the rent. Gary then recommended that he come to work with Gary at the grocery store. The owners of the grocery store were very pleased with Gary's progress in getting his GED and held him in high regard, and they immediately agreed to hire his roommate. In the hiring process, they discovered Gary's roommate did not have a high school diploma or a GED. They recommended to the roommate to study with Gary in the process of getting his GED. While Gary was a fairly bright kid, the roommate was not so much, and it didn't take long to realize that the roommate was going to need some help. Gary explained it to the owners, and the owners agreed to get him a tutor. A few days later, the owners gave Gary's roommate a phone number and explained that it was a tutor who was going to help him with his study. He was to call and make arrangements with the tutor to help him. The owners saw to it that Gary and his roommate had the same day off so that they could study together and prepare to pass the GED exam. Gary's roommate made arrangements over the phone with his tutor to come by their apartment to help him study. Gary and his roommate looked forward with anticipation on the day that the tutor was supposed to arrive, but were disappointed when the tutor was over an hour late. Gary had just decided to turn on his video game when there was a knock at the door. Doubly frustrated, Gary answered the door and seemed a little less than hospitable at the young lady standing at the door. She explained that she was sorry she was late and she was here to tutor Gary's roommate. Gary stepped by and let her in and called his roommate. Gary's roommate was happy to see the tutor and did everything he could to make her feel welcome. When Gary's roommate asked if Gary was going to join them to study, Gary refused and went back to playing his video game. 3 hours later, after the study session had ended, Gary's roommate and his tutor scheduled their next meeting and then escorted the tutor to the door. She also said goodbye to Gary, who didn't even turn around, just waved his hand and continued playing his game. After she left, Gary's roommate asked Gary why he was giving her the cold shoulder. Gary replied that she was late and you can't count on people who can't keep their appointments. Gary's dislike of the tutor was also based on a familiarity that he saw in her, but couldn't quite put his finger on it. The next day, when Gary and his roommate went back to work, the owners approached him and asked him how the tutoring session went. Gary's roommate replied to the owners that he was very happy with the tutoring session and the tutor, and that he was looking forward to their next session. Then the owner asked Gary what his impression was. Gary reluctantly replied that he didn't think very much of the tutor because she was late coming to the appointment. The owner then told Gary that he was aware that the tutor was late getting to the appointment, and it was because she was with him going over the background of the students that she was supposed to tutor. Gary heard this and still felt uneasy about the tutor. For the next appointment, Gary made it a point to not be home when she arrived. When Gary did come home, he found his roommate playing a video game. He sat down next to him and they began to talk. Gary's roommate told Gary they had a good time studying and he learned a lot, and also learned a lot about her. She told Gary's roommate how when she was younger, her mother was on drugs and made life difficult for her at home, and that she realized the only way out was through getting a good education, and so she tried to excel at school. Her mother, on the other hand, would deride her and tell her how she wasn't special and she was never going to amount to anything. And because of this, she was able to graduate early. After she graduated, her mother decided that she's smart enough to graduate, she's smart enough to make it on her own, and put her out. She immediately made her way to the shelter, where she met a nice lady who worked there. And after a while, they became friends, and she told the lady her story, how she ended up at the shelter. The lady decided to take her in, telling her that she lost her child to the streets, and that's why she was working at the shelter. She stayed with the lady until she got accepted to college, and then moved away to attend school, and that's how she came to be their tutor. She had recently arrived to college, her aunt and uncle owned the grocery store, and gave her the job as the tutor. Then Gary's roommate said that she had a lot of questions about you, Gary. I think she likes you. Gary was really surprised to hear the whole story, and even more surprised to hear that she was interested in him. Gary then asked his roommate when was she supposed to come back, and his roommate responded, on our next day off. On the day before Gary's day off, the owners told Gary that they needed him to come to work the next day, and that since he was doing so good on the GED without the tutor, he didn't need her help. Reluctantly, Gary agreed. The next day, Gary went to work as usual, and at lunchtime, the owners came to Gary and said, I need to see you in my office. Gary followed the owner to the office. When he opened the door, there, standing in the office, was Gary's mother and his stepfather. This brings to an end part 1. I hope you stay tuned for part 2.